Rain found every seam in Nancy Webber's pelisse before the light had fully risen. It ran from her bonnet brim into her collar, down her spine, along her stockings, and settled in her shoes until each step held a small, cold pool. She stood in the Bath Road coaching yard beside 3 lacquered trunks painted with Mrs. Webber's crest, though none belonged to her, and kept both hands on the largest strap because the porter had been told she would watch the luggage herself. Her fingers had gone nearly white at the knuckles. The skin around her nails had cracked in 4 places. She did not shift her weight, though her left ankle throbbed from the previous day's loading. Travellers crossed the yard in cloaks and polished boots, glancing once toward the young woman left in the rain, and then away again with the practised discretion of people who wished to arrive anywhere except another person's shame. The rear bench of the family carriage had been folded down for her, not a seat inside, not even a stool near the footman. The bench was narrow, rain-slick, exposed to wheel spray and wind, intended for baggage when there was too much to tie on top. Mrs. Webber had given that order in front of 2 coachmen and 3 strangers. "My stepdaughter is accustomed to rough conditions," she had said, lavender heavy in the wet air, her voice smooth as silk over steel. "She may ride where she is useful." Nancy had inclined her head and answered nothing because even a narrow answer invited consequence, and consequence in Mrs. Webber's household was always practical. A skipped meal, a locked door, a task repeated until hands bled and then repeated once more for insolence. A wrapped parcel sat in Nancy's pocket, hard at the edges where yesterday's bread had turned to stone. She had not opened it in 2 days. Hunger had settled past sharpness into a dull inward ache that made her feel both heavy and hollow. When she swallowed, her throat scraped. When she breathed too deeply, her stomach pinched as if a fist closed there. She watched a family descend from the Exeter coach. A little boy carried asleep beneath a wool blanket, his mother's hand under his head, so his neck would not jar against her shoulder, and she felt a quick, hard pull low in her chest that was not envy, only memory. Her father had held books that way, careful at the spine, as if paper had bone and breath. The yard's bell clanged once. Ostlers shouted, a horse stamped and tossed foam. Nancy moved because stillness drew rebuke. She took a valise from the mud before it soaked through and wiped the brass clasp with the edge of her sleeve. She retied the lashings on the top trunk when the knot loosened. She lifted a hat box that was too fine to touch with wet gloves and carried it under the eaves so rain would not stain the ribbon, though her own hem dragged through puddles and gathered grit. No one thanked her. Mrs. Webber stepped down from the inn-stair in plum silk and did not look at Nancy directly. She looked at the trunks, then at the coach clock, then at Nancy's hands, and the displeasure that crossed her face was the thin displeasure of finding a servant present, but not invisible enough. "You are dripping on the leather," Mrs. Webber said. Nancy moved 3 paces farther into open rain. "Do not skulk. Stand where I may see you." Nancy returned at once. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Webber adjusted her glove. Her daughters followed in pale morning wraps, pearl pins bright against carefully arranged curls. They smelled of violet soap and warm milk. One of them, Clara, glanced at Nancy's pelisse and gave a tiny laugh into her hand, not quite hidden. "She looks half drowned," Clara murmured. "Plain girls often do," her sister answered. Mrs. Webber did not rebuke them. She turned toward the inn door and spoke over her shoulder. "Bring my writing case upstairs. Carefully. If the inkwell breaks, you will pay for it." Nancy lifted the leather case with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, brass corners biting into her palm through wet wool. She carried it through the crowded corridor where gentlemen shook rain from hats and servants jostled with trays, then up the narrow service stair that smelled of damp plaster and burnt tallow. On the second landing she paused once, only once, to steady the case against her hip as pain lanced through her wrist. A scullery maid passed, eyes flicking to Nancy's face and away, sympathy there and powerless. Nancy climbed the final steps without sound. The upstairs room had one window, one desk, and a fire gone to embers. Mrs. Webber took the case from her without thanks and opened it with quick, elegant movements. Papers, sealing wax, a silver pen knife, 2 folded bills, a bottle of scent. Nancy stood near the door awaiting dismissal while rain tracked the glass in narrow lines. The room had likely been borrowed from the innkeeper for a quarter hour. Strangers' ink marks scarred the desk. Someone had left a dropped button near the hearth. Mrs. Webber wrote 3 short notes, sealed 2, and then looked up with impatience, sharpened by haste. "Do not stand there like furniture. You have 10 minutes before we depart. If you must scratch your little reply to His Grace, do it now and be done. You will write that you are grateful beyond words." Nancy's pulse struck once, hard. "Ma'am!" Mrs. Webber's gaze did not lift. "You were asked for your consent as a courtesy, not from need. We are past courtesy." She rose, gathered her letters, and paused close enough that lavender and rosewater pressed into Nancy's breath. "If you write anything except compliance, I shall have you declared unsound. There are institutions prepared to keep difficult young women out of sight. You understand me." Nancy understood every word. She had learned to hear threat as accountancy, cost named, cost collected. Mrs. Webber left, silk whispering against the doorframe, and the latch clicked behind her. For several seconds Nancy could not move. Her hand remained on the back of the chair, knuckles rigid while rain drummed softly on the pane, and voices rose from the yard below. Then she crossed to the desk and sat on the very edge of the chair, as if borrowing space from someone wealthier. The quill felt clumsy and in cold fingers. Ink blotted at once where her hand trembled. She pressed her palm flat on the paper to still it, and felt how rough her skin had become, raw along the base of her thumb from rope and lie, and carrying coal scuttles up 3 flights when the scullery boy was dismissed to save wages. She had not always known that roomlessness could be engineered with such precision. Since her father's death, one practical subtraction after another had narrowed her life. Her mare sold in April to settle a gaming debt that was not her father's. Her books locked in a cedar chest to discourage idleness. The old groom dismissed. Mrs. Davies in the kitchen pensioned off without pension. The study where her father had read aloud turned into a card room where gentlemen laughed over green felt and candle smoke, while Nancy carried trays past his portrait turned to face the wall. Last week, when creditors came, Mrs. Webber had stood in the drawing-room and introduced Nancy as if presenting a cracked plate at auction. Plain, ungrateful, expensive. The Duke's proposal had been placed on the table in that same tone, not as marriage, not as choice, but as a figure balancing an account. Nancy dipped the pen again and began. "Your Grace, I received through my stepmother the honour of your offer made in regard to debts attached to my late father's estate." The nib scratched. She wrote slowly because haste invited blot and blot, invited mockery when the letter was read aloud by hands not hers. Her sentences were formal, spare, exact. She would not enter a marriage in which her person was collateral. She would not be purchased to launder another household's reputation. She regretted any inconvenience her answer caused, and accepted whatever consequences followed. The words did not rise from courage. They rose from exhaustion so complete it had hardened into clarity. She could endure hunger. She could endure labour. She could not endure the erasure of consent while pretending gratitude for the privilege. She signed her name in full, Nancy Ann Weber. For a moment she stared at it, at the firmness of the final stroke, at proof that her hand still obeyed her when ordered by no one else. Then she reached for her own small satchel hidden beneath the chair. Inside lay one stick of dark red sealing wax, worn nearly to the wick, saved from her father's desk before Mrs. Weber's inventories began. She lit the end from the hearth ember with a splinter of kindling, waited for the bead to soften, and let it fall in a single, careful circle. Her seal was plain metal, no crest, only an N cut by her father when she was 13, and proud to stamp her school essays. She pressed it into the wax. When she lifted it, the impression held. Below, someone shouted for the London post. Nancy folded the letter, wrapped it in oilskin torn from an old account book, and tucked it inside her sleeve. She left the writing room, descended the back stair, and crossed the passage where steam from the kitchen turned the air briefly warm against her face. At the inn gate, a post boy in a cap too large for his head was checking satchels against a list, impatient in the rain. "Bath post, miss. I am late already." "This must go now," Nancy said, and placed the letter in his hand. He held up 2 fingers. 2 pence! She had 1 coin sewn into her hem for emergencies, hidden there since Michaelmas. She slipped a pin from her cuff, bent, and worked the stitch loose with numb fingertips, while water ran from her sleeve to the stones. The coin came free, dull with thread lint. She gave it to him. He squinted at the direction, then at her face. "Rathmere House, London." "Yes." He tucked it into the leather pouch without comment, and mounted in one swift movement. Hooves struck sparks from wet cobble as he rode out through the gate. Nancy remained where she stood for a breath longer than she should have, rain on her upturned face, empty sleeve clinging to her wrist. Cost named, cost paid. She had no illusion about what would follow once Mrs. Weber learned the letter had been sent untampered and on time. A blow, perhaps. Exile, likely. Something colder, more administrative, if the threat about confinement had been more than theatre. Yet, beneath fear, small and stubborn as a banked ember, sat a steadier fact. She had written no, and the no existed in ink beyond Mrs. Weber's reach. A whistle cut the yard. Their coach was loading. Nancy returned to the trunks, lifted the wet strap again, and waited to be tied to the rear bench like baggage, while the morning widened, grey and pitiless, over the road to Bath. The coachman snapped the traces tight, and Nancy climbed to the rear bench without being told twice, skirts gathered clear of the wheel, while rain slid from the brim of her bonnet into her eyes. The leather was slick as ice. She set one hand beneath the iron rail and the other on the trunk lashings, because a hard rut could throw her backward into the road, and no one inside would hear her call through the wind. Mrs. Weber's gloved hand appeared at the carriage window for one instant, lifting the curtain with 2 fingers so she could inspect Nancy, as she might inspect a crate tied badly for shipping. "Sit straighter," she said. "You disgrace us by drooping." The curtain fell again. Inside, Clara laughed at something small and bright, the sound muffled by glass and velvet. The coach lurched forward. Mud flew from the front wheels in a fan and struck Nancy across the shin. She did not flinch. The first mile passed under a sky the colour of pewter, hedges stripped by weather, fields lying flat and wet to the horizon. At the first toll gate the keeper looked up, saw the carriage crest, then saw the young woman lashed to the back in soaked wool, and his mouth tightened in that brief expression people wore when they wished to object, but preferred wages to conscience. Nancy kept her eyes on the road ruts and felt the parcel in her pocket knock lightly against her hip at each jolt, a hollow reminder of bread she had not yet earned permission to eat. Through the panel she could hear fragments of talk whenever the wheels slowed. Clara wanted the blue silk for Bath. Millicent wanted the pearl comb repaired before the assembly rooms. Mrs. Webber said both requests were vulgar while approving both in the same breath. Then, as casually as discussing ribbon, she added, "If any person asks after Nancy's place in the household, you will say she assists with trunks from gratitude for our generosity." A pause. Millicent's voice light and incurious. "Must we still call her sister in public?" Mrs. Webber answered at once. "Call her nothing unless spoken to directly." Nancy's fingers tightened on the rail until the cracked skin at her knuckles burned. She had once ridden inside that carriage beside her father as he pointed out old boundary stones and spoke of tenant roofs needing repair before winter. He had smelled of wet wool and ink. He had asked her opinion and listened as if a girl of 16 had the right to one. The same carriage now carried her as freight, the same crest on the door, the same brass lanterns, and not 1 inch inside it left for her body. By the time they crossed the second toll and turned toward the long descent where the Bath road curved between bare elms, the rain had thinned to a hard mist that settled in her lashes and made every breath taste of iron. Her hands had gone from pain to numbness. Numbness was dangerous. Numbness made grip uncertain. She shifted her right palm once, rubbed it against her pelisse to wake the nerves, and in that small movement the past rose with brutal precision, not as story but as sequence of receipts collected against her. Her mother had died in a summer fever when Nancy was 9. The house had gone quiet for a year, then raw with effort. Her father had remarried Mrs. Webber at the urging of 2 neighbouring gentlemen and 1 vicar who praised order above tenderness. A practical match, they had called it. A widow with 2 daughters, sound connections, excellent economy. For 2 years Mrs. Webber had played at gentleness with perfect discipline. She corrected servants softly. She praised Nancy's penmanship at tea. She wore muted colours and spoke of duty. Then her father took ill in late November, a cough that deepened, a physician delayed by snow, a fortnight of sheets changed 3 times a day while the house smelled of vinegar and laudanum. Nancy had sat through those nights counting his breaths and reading psalms when his hands shook too hard to hold the page. He had died before dawn, with rain on the windows and 1 unfinished sentence on his lips about the Northfield lease. The morning after the funeral, Mrs. Webber asked for the keyring. By candlelight that same evening she opened drawers in the study and made lists in a neat legal hand. Silver, paintings, bonds, livestock. Nancy had stood in the doorway in black crepe and watched her father's pocket watch weighed against debt notes she had never seen. "There are obligations you did not understand," Mrs. Webber had said without looking up. "Girls never do." Within a month Nancy's mare was sold. Within 2, the old groom was gone. By spring the library cabinets were locked and the key removed to Mrs. Webber's reticule. At breakfast one morning Nancy asked for her Euclid and her father's atlas, and Clara, already buttering toast with languid ease, said, "You read too much for your station." Millicent added, "You are pale enough without philosophy." Mrs. Webber had folded her napkin and replied, "Books are privileges, not rights." The words had landed gently. They had done their work. Nancy learned then that cruelty did not require raised voices. It required repetition, record-keeping, and witnesses willing to smile into their cups. At the next posting in, the carriage halted only long enough to change horses, yet even 10 minutes could be used for hierarchy. A footman jumped down. Mrs. Webber stepped out under an umbrella held by another servant and crossed the yard without a glance backward. Clara and Millicent followed, lifting their hems clear of puddles with practised fingers. Nancy slid from the rear bench, knees stiff from bracing, and reached for the writing case before anyone ordered it. "Do not drip on the clasp," Millicent said as she passed. "It tarnishes." Nancy carried the case under the eaves and waited near the kitchen door while the family took chocolate in the private room. Steam and onion and fresh bread drifted through the half-open scullery hatch, warm enough to make her empty stomach twist sharply. A kitchen maid glanced at her, then at the closed parlour door, and set a chipped cup of hot water on the barrel beside her without a word. Nancy wrapped her hands around the cup for heat, and did not drink until the maid had turned away, because kindness in that house's orbit often came at someone else's cost. Inside the parlour, voices rose and fell. Mrs. Webber was speaking to a gentleman whose accent marked him as one of the Bath creditors. "My late husband's daughter exaggerates her expectations," she said, calm as polished wood. "The estate was burdened before I arrived. I have carried more than my share." The gentleman murmured something about trustees. Mrs. Webber gave a soft laugh. "Trustees are men who enjoy signatures. They do not manage households." Clara asked whether the Duke's proposal remained active. "It remains useful," Mrs. Webber answered, "if she is tractable." Nancy looked down at her own cuff, where 2 stitches had come loose, and thought of the letter already on the post road. Tractable had closed behind her an hour earlier. When the parlour door opened, Mrs. Webber handed Nancy the empty chocolate flask, as if returning an item to storage. "You will remember this," she said, in a tone meant for servants and daughters alike. "Comfort is earned by obedience. Security is earned by gratitude. Should you misstate yourself to any person of rank, I shall submit testimony that your nerves are unstable and your judgment impaired." She adjusted her glove and added almost pleasantly, "There are houses where agitated women are kept from harming themselves. You would be quiet there." At last, Nancy met her eyes only long enough to answer, "I understand your meaning, ma'am." She did not add that she had understood it for years. She did not say that each threat had taught her where the bars were and where, if one looked with patience, the lock might fail. She set down the chipped cup. The hot water had gone cold. They resumed the road under a sky brightening to a cruel white that offered light without warmth. The wind sharpened as the land opened. It cut through wet wool and settled in Nancy's bones until her teeth wanted to strike together, and she held her jaw tight to stop it. Inside the carriage, the sisters argued over lace and invitations, then over Nancy as though she were absent, then over whether she ought to be sent north to distant cousins who would take a small allowance for keeping her out of sight. "No one will marry her now," Clara said, "not after all this talk." Mrs. Webber replied, "Marriage is not the only mechanism for disposal." The words reached Nancy through wood and rain and wheel noise, distinct as bells. Her father's signet ring, taken from his desk, had later appeared on Clara's hand as a novelty. Her mother's shawl had been cut apart by Millicent for trimming on a travelling cloak. Her own room had been relinquished first for guests, then for storage, then for nothing but denial, until she slept in the narrow attic beside trunks of winter linen and woke each dawn with frost on the inside of the pane. Mrs. Davies had been dismissed after 30 years because she gave Nancy broth without asking. The study door stayed locked while cards snapped against green bays where her father's maps had once lain open, and one night creditors laughed in the drawing-room while Mrs. Webber called Nancy plain, ungrateful, expensive, each adjective laid down like a coin to settle debt with someone else's flesh. The inventory had no end because each day added one more ordinary theft. A meal reduced, a message intercepted, a name spoken with contempt until even servants adopted it for safety. Yet the letter now existed beyond this carriage, on its way to Rathmere House in London, beyond this road, beyond Mrs. Webber's ledger of punishments. That fact did not warm her, it steadied her. Ahead the traffic thickened as they neared the outer coaching yards, wagons and chaises crowding the lane, drivers shouting over one another in wet air. Mrs. Webber struck the carriage roof with her parasol handle for the coachman to slow, and called through the panel without opening it. "When we stop, you will keep to the mud side and hold your tongue. You are here to carry, not to be seen." Nancy answered through chattering breath she controlled by force. "Yes, ma'am." She tightened her grip on the rear rail as the wheels jolted over broken stone and the coach rolled toward the in-gate where noon traffic snarled, horses reared against their bits, and strangers turned to stare before they even knew her name. Nancy tightened her grip on the rear rail as the coach rolled the last yards toward the in-gate, wheels grinding against broken stone, horses blowing hard through flared nostrils while drivers cursed one another in the narrowed lane. A wagon had stalled crosswise near the arch. 2 post-chaises tried to pass at once. A groom ran between shafts with his hands up, shouting for space no one gave him. Then sounds split. A sharp crack of harness leather. A mare screamed. The chaise to their right slewed sideways, one wheel climbing the curb, then dropping with a blow that snapped the axle clean. The carriage pitched, its near horse reared, struck out, and dragged the broken body of the chaise half around before the traces tore free. Someone inside cried out. A small body flew from the open door and struck the mud 3 yards from the hooves. Nancy was already moving. She dropped from the rear bench, boots sinking to the ankle, and ran into the churned centre of the yard, while men shouted for her to get back. The child lay twisted on his side, face white under rain, one arm at a wrong angle, breath coming in thin, frightened bursts. A wheel spun past and clipped her skirt hem. She fell to one knee, slid, got her footing again, and threw herself over him as the loose horse plunged near enough that mud struck her cheek like shot. "Hold his head," she said to no one and everyone, voice raw. "Hold his head steady." No one knelt. No one touched him. The inn-yard had gone into that cowardly pause where rank and danger were measured before mercy. Nancy pulled the boy into her lap and felt his small bones shudder with shock. Blood ran from a cut along his hairline into his brow, not deep, but frightening in the rain. His arm would not wait. She ripped her sleeve from wrist to elbow with both hands, tore the lining free and bound above the brake to keep it still while she scanned the mud for anything straight. A splintered carriage slat lay near the wheel rut. She snatched it, wrapped it in cloth, and set it against his forearm as gently as her shaking hands allowed. "Look at me," she whispered. "Look only at me. You are not alone." His lashes fluttered. He made one thin sound like a swallowed cry and clutched her bodice with his uninjured hand. Behind her, Mrs. Webber's voice cut through the yard, shrill with fury and fear of witnesses. "Nancy, leave that child at once. Do you hear me? Stand up. You will not make a spectacle." Nancy did not look back. Rain ran down the bridge of her nose and into her mouth, copper and grit and cold. She tightened the improvised bandage and called toward the crowd, "I need a belt or a strap and someone to hold this splint." A stable boy stepped forward, then froze when Mrs. Webber snapped his name, and he retreated as if burned. Nancy shifted positions so her body shielded the boy's face from the rain and pressed 2 fingers to his throat the way her father had taught her when a tenant had fallen from a hay wagon years earlier. Fast pulse. Too fast. Still there. The The boy's eyes rolled toward her. "My mamma," he gasped. "I know," she said. "She is coming. Breathe slowly." "Follow my hand." She lifted and lowered her free palm in a rhythm he could match. In the jolt and shouting and wet chaos, the smallest obedience became a line back to calm. By noon, the rain had thickened from mist to a hard, straight fall, and in the grey wash of it, another carriage came through the gate at speed, lacquer dark as gunmetal, crest half obscured by road spray. It stopped with brutal precision. A man in a black greatcoat stepped down before the footman could lower the stair. His boots hit mud. He did not hesitate. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair damp at the temples, jaw cut like carved stone. Everything about him was controlled except the stillness that took him for one fraction of a breath when he saw the child in Nancy's arms, and Nancy kneeling in filth with torn sleeves and blood on her cuff. Then he moved again. "Take that horse's head," he said to the nearest groom. "Now!" The command landed like iron. Men obeyed. 2 ostlers seized the bridle. Another grabbed the trailing traces before they fouled under the wheel. The yard found direction because one voice had given it. The man crossed to Nancy in 3 long strides and stopped just outside the reach of her muddy skirt, eyes lowering once to the boy's arm, once to the splint, once to Nancy's hands. His gaze was the colour of deep water before a storm, unreadable at first look, exact on the second. "Who set that?" he asked. Nancy swallowed rain. "I did, sir. It was moving. I had to fix it before transport." He turned his head a degree. "Pritchard!" A grey-haired physician pushed forward, breathless, leather case in hand. The man in black did not raise his voice. "You will examine the child. You will not disturb the arm unless necessary. She has stabilized it." Mrs. Webber reached them at last, silk skirts lifted clear of mud by sheer outrage. Lavender struck the wet air. "Your Grace, you must forgive this disgrace. The girl is hysterical. She has no training." "Nancy, stand up when spoken to." "Your Grace." The words struck Nancy a beat late. Duke of Rathmere. She had seen his likeness in lithographs in shop windows, and once, in a newspaper engraving folded under tea-things, all angles and austerity and a title people lowered their voices to pronounce. She had written him a refusal 3 hours before dawn, and sent it with her last coin. Now he stood over her while mud soaked through her stockings, and a child clung to her torn bodice, as if she were the only fixed point in the world. Mrs. Webber's hand closed on Nancy's shoulder and yanked. "Up!" The boy whimpered when the movement jarred him. Nancy twisted back to shield him, and Mrs. Webber struck her across the mouth with the flat of her fingers. A quick, practised blow meant less to injure than to remind everyone present who owned correction. The Duke's head turned. He stepped between them so suddenly the silk of Mrs. Webber's sleeve brushed his coat and stopped. "Do not touch her again." The yard went silent, except for rain and the hiss of a frightened horse. Mrs. Webber laughed too brightly. "Your Grace, this is a private family discipline. She is my stepdaughter. She forgets her place." His eyes did not leave Nancy's face. "Her lip is split. Her hands are cracked to the bone. She is soaked through and half-starved, and she is steadier than any soul in this yard." Heat rose under Nancy's skin at the public naming of what she had spent months pretending did not show. She wanted to wipe the blood from her mouth. She could not free a hand without jostling the boy. Pritchard knelt opposite her and touched the child's wrist, then the splint, brows lifting despite himself. "Well placed," he muttered. Louder, to the Duke, "She is correct, Your Grace. We should carry him as he is." The Duke gave one short nod. "Do it." A woman broke from the crowd then, bonnet askew, face blanched with terror. "Thomas! Thomas!" She dropped beside them, touching the child's hair with trembling fingers. Nancy shifted carefully so a mother and son could see each other without moving the arm. The boy's breath eased by degrees. Nancy did not realise she had been holding her own until her chest hurt. The Duke crouched to the child's level, greatcoat darkening with mud at the hem, and spoke in the same clipped tone he had used to command grooms and physicians. "Thomas, you will ride in my carriage. You will keep your arm still and look at your mother, not the road. Can you do that?" The child nodded once, against Nancy's shoulder. "Good." 2 men brought a door panel from the wrecked chaise to use as a litter. Nancy and Pritchard guided the transfer inch by inch. When Thomas was laid down and strapped, his hand sought blindly and found Nancy's sleeve. He did not release it until his mother promised, voice breaking, that she would be beside him every moment. Only then did his fingers loosen. Nancy sat back on her heels in the mud, suddenly light-headed. The yard tilted and corrected. She braced one palm on the stones. Blood from her split lip had thinned to pink rainwater at her chin. The Duke was standing again, looking at her as if the crowd had fallen away. "Word reached me that you sent a letter to Rathmere House this morning," he said. There was no gentleness in the sentence, no accusation either, only a statement laid between them. Nancy lifted her face. Her voice came rough but clear. "Then you know my answer, Your Grace." Something passed over his expression and was gone before she could name it. Not anger, not surprise, a colder concentration, as if he were fitting one visible fact to another and rejecting convenient lies between them. Mrs. Webber stepped in fast, smile fixed for witnesses. "A childish misunderstanding, I assure you. The letter was written under strain. Nancy is prone to dramatics. We are, in truth, honoured beyond measure by your proposal." Nancy pushed to her feet, knees unsteady, and kept her eyes on the Duke, not on Mrs. Webber's warning stare. "I wrote as I intended." Mrs. Webber's nails bit into Nancy's elbow. "You will apologise." The Duke's gaze dropped to the hand on Nancy's arm. "Remove your hand, Mrs. Webber." The hand withdrew at once. He addressed Nancy without looking away from her face. "Come inside before you collapse." It was an order. It was also unmistakably shelter offered in the only language he seemed to trust. Nancy shook her head once toward the departing litter. "The child is under my physician's care. He will wake frightened. He should see one face he knows." "Then you will come inside and stand where he can see you breathing. You are shivering." Only then did she feel it, the tremor running through her shoulders and into her jaw, delayed by urgency, and now impossible to hide. She hated that he had noticed. She hated more that he was right. Mrs. Webber seized the opening. "She shall ride with us at once. We are already delayed, and this entire scene has been most unfortunate." The Duke turned to his coachman. "Bring my carriage to the side entrance." Then, to an officer who had just entered the gate, in magistrate blue, drawn by noise and wreckage, he said, "Take statements from all witnesses. No one leaves until names are recorded." Mrs. Webber's colour shifted beneath powder. "Surely that is unnecessary." He looked at her for the first time directly, and the temperature of the moment dropped. "A child was thrown from a carriage. A woman was struck in public. Necessary is not your decision." The officer bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." Around them, pens scratched in wet ledgers, ostlers righted the broken chaise, and watchers who had pretended not to see now gave their accounts eagerly, smelling the turn of power and stepping toward it like moths to heat. Nancy stood very still while rain tapped the brim of her bonnet and ran down the bandage she had tied with her own sleeve. Her lip throbbed, her stomach cramped with emptiness. Her hand burned where the splinter had torn it. She had been ordered all morning not to be seen, Now half the yard watched her breathe. The Duke held out his glove, not to touch her, to show direction toward the inn door where Thomas's litter had disappeared. "Walk!" Nancy obeyed, because the child was inside, because her legs might fail if she waited, and because for the first time in months a command spoken in public had been used to move danger away from her instead of nearer. She crossed the threshold with mud on her hem and blood at her mouth, aware of the Duke 1 pace behind, aware of Mrs. Webber following with silk rustling like a warning in the corridor, and aware that the letter she had written at dawn had not ended this matter. It had only brought the man she refused directly into her path. And now that path narrowed to a dim corridor that smelled of wet wool, lamp smoke, and vinegar. Thomas had been carried into a private parlour near the kitchen, where the heat from the range reached in weak pulses through the wall. A table had been pushed aside. A settle was dragged near the hearth. Pritchard knelt at once and opened his leather case with brisk hands, laying out bandage rolls, a small saw, a packet of powdered laudanum, 2 polished splints. Thomas's mother, still shaking, stood at his head, with both palms on his hair, as if touch alone could keep him tethered. Nancy moved to the opposite side of the settle before anyone asked. Mud dried in flakes on her skirt. Rainwater dripped from her cuffs onto the rush mat. Her teeth had begun to knock together in spite of her efforts to hold still. "Look at me," she told Thomas quietly when his eyes darted toward the instruments, not at his hands. "Is at mine," the child obeyed. He fixed on her face and breathed too fast. Pritchard glanced up once. "He must be kept still when I set it. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then do not let him twist, whatever he does." Mrs. Webber entered with Clara and Millicent 2 paces behind. Silk and perfume and outrage carried into the room like another weather. She stopped just inside the threshold and took in the scene with a look of precise distaste. "Nancy, you are staining the rug. Stand away from that child this instant." Thomas whimpered and clutched harder at Nancy's sleeve. Nancy did not look back. "He will move if I leave. You presume far above yourself." The Duke's voice came from the doorway behind Mrs. Webber. "She stays." No one answered him. No one needed to. Pritchard set his fingers to Thomas's forearm and gave 1 short warning. "This will hurt for a moment, lad. Be brave." Thomas cried out when the bone slid into place. The sound cut through Nancy's chest like wire. She held him steady through the convulsion. 1 arm braced across his shoulders, the other hand spread over his uninjured wrist, so he could feel pressure and follow it back to stillness. He buried his face against her torn sleeve and shook until the worst passed. "There," she whispered. "There! It is done." Pritchard wrapped and tied with swift economy. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and exhaled through his nose. "Well held," he said, not to Thomas, but to Nancy. The praise landed harder than rebuke. She lowered her eyes and nodded once. The Duke stepped closer to inspect the bandage. Rain had darkened the shoulders of his greatcoat to near black. His cravat was flecked with mud where the horse had reared. He said to Pritchard, "Will the arm mend straight?" "With rest and care, yes." "He has been fortunate." "Fortunate," Mrs. Webber repeated lightly, "because we happened to be present with proper supervision." Nancy felt Thomas stiffen under her hand at the tone. Children knew contempt even when aimed elsewhere. She bent and spoke into his hairline so only he could hear. "Your arm is bound well. You did exactly right." His breathing steadied by degrees. A constable appeared at the door and touched 2 fingers to his hat. "Your Grace, the officer requests the witnesses in order." The Duke gave a short nod. "Begin with the drivers, then the ostlers. Mrs. Webber may wait." Mrs. Webber's smile thinned. "I do not wait in service passages." "Then you may wait in the tap room. You do not enter this room again unless invited." Colour rose beneath her powder. For one beat, Nancy thought she would defy him and force a public break she could not win. Instead, she turned with a rustle of silk that seemed louder than shouting. "Come, girls." Clara lingered just long enough to let her gaze travel over Nancy's torn cuff, split lip, and muddied hem with a small curl of amusement, then followed. When the corridor emptied, the room expanded by an inch. Pritchard began issuing instructions to Thomas's mother in practical terms. Cool compress for fever, no weight on the arm. Wake him every hour through the afternoon. Nancy listened and realised by the woman's face that half of it had not landed. "May I write it for her?" she asked. Pritchard looked surprised. "You would?" "Yes, if there is paper." The Duke answered before the physician could. "There is." He turned to the footman at his shoulder. "Ink, paper, a tray." The man vanished. Nancy almost said she could stand to write. Then the room tilted gently left and corrected, warning enough. She remained seated on the edge of the settle, hands folded to hide their tremor. Within minutes the tray arrived. Nancy wiped her right hand on her damp skirt, took the pen and wrote in a narrow, even script despite fingers stiff from cold. "Keep him warm and upright. No broth until the sickness passes. Water in small sips. If fever rises above mild heat, send at once for Mr. Pritchard. Do not loosen the wrap except by instruction." She added simple marks beside each line so Thomas's mother could match them quickly in distress. When she finished, she blew the page dry and read it aloud once, slow and clear. The woman listened with both hands clasped at her throat, then took the sheet as if it were coin. "I do not know how to thank you." Nancy shook her head. "Watch his breathing tonight. That is thanks enough." By the time the hall clock struck 1, the noise from the yard had settled from crisis to process. Wheels were righted, horses changed, names entered in ledgers. The rain eased to a fine, steady fall that tapped the window panes like fingernails. Thomas slept at last, lashes still wet against his cheeks. His mother sat beside him and would not be moved. Pritchard rose, gathered his instruments, and turned to Nancy. "Your lip should be cleaned before it closes badly. Your hand also." "It is nothing." "Liar," he said without malice. "You left skin on that splinter." Before she could answer, the Duke spoke from where he stood near the hearth, still as a carved post. "Sit." Nancy sat. Pritchard cleaned the cut at her mouth first. The sting made her eyes water. She blinked hard until it passed. Then he opened her right palm and hissed softly through his teeth at the state of it. Rope burn, fresh tear, ground in grit, old cracks reopened by wet and strain. "This is not from today," he said. "No!" "Hold still." He worked with brisk care, lifting debris with tweezers, rinsing, wrapping the heel of her hand in narrow linen. Nancy stared at the hearth bricks and counted breaths, because counting gave pain a frame. On the 7th breath, she became aware that the Duke had not moved once since treatment began. When Pritchard tied off the final knot, he looked toward the Duke. "She requires warmth and food." The Duke's reply was immediate. "She will have both." Nancy found her voice. "I can return to the carriage." "No," he said. One word, flat, final. She looked up then, compelled against prudence. His eyes were on the fresh bandage. His jaw had tightened enough that a faint scar at the edge of his temple stood pale against the damp skin. "I am not your charge, Your Grace." "You are a witness in an active inquiry. You are also half frozen. Both facts are relevant." Truth and command braided so tightly she could not split them. A knock sounded. The constable returned, hat in hand. "Officer Hale requests Miss Webber's statement now." Mrs. Webber appeared at his shoulder as if conjured by her own name, Lavender preceding her. "She is in no condition. I shall speak for her." Nancy rose before anyone else could answer. The room swayed once. She steadied against the settle and took one step toward the door. "I will speak for myself." Mrs. Webber's gaze sharpened to a private blade. "Be careful!" The Duke's voice made the warning meaningless. "She will give her account in my presence." The statement room had been set in the inn's smaller dining parlour, cleared of guests. A ledger lay open on the table beside blotting sand and 3 spare quills. Officer Hale sat with his coat still wet at the shoulders, expression professional and tired. 2 drivers waited along the wall. A stable boy stood near the corner, twisting his cap so hard the brim had bent. Nancy recognised him at once. He was the one who had stepped toward Thomas when she asked for help, then stopped at Mrs. Webber's command. Hale dipped his pen. Name: Nancy Ann Webber. Residence: she gave it. Relation to the parties involved: stepdaughter to Mrs. Webber. No relation to the injured child. Hale nodded. State what you observed from the moment of impact. Nancy did. She kept to sequence: the stalled wagon, the broken axle, the thrown child, her own actions, the horse's movement, Pritchard's arrival. She did not dramatise. She did not soften. When she reached the moment the stable boy hesitated, Hale looked up. Did this lad refuse assistance? The boy's face drained of colour. Nancy saw in one sharp flash the likely result of one careless word: dismissal by nightfall. No character reference, no wages owed. A family somewhere waiting on coin that would not arrive. She also saw Mrs. Webber 3 feet away, watching for the answer that would best preserve her authority over everyone in her orbit. Nancy folded her bandaged hand under her left sleeve and answered evenly. He stepped forward at once. He was called back by his employer before he reached us. The stable boy stared at her, stunned. Hale scratched the line into his ledger. Called back by whom? Nancy met his eyes. Mrs. Webber. Silk rustled. Mrs. Webber leaned in. That is a malicious mishearing from a distressed girl. Officer, she is subject to nervous episodes. We have consulted... Did you strike Miss Webber? Hale asked, cutting across her. Mrs. Webber laughed once, brittle as glass. I corrected her in a moment of panic. She was making a scene in public mud. Any mother would do the same. I am not her daughter, Nancy said quietly. Hale's pen paused. Mrs. Webber turned on her with contained fury. Ungrateful child, I fed you, clothed you, sheltered you when your father left ruin behind him. Nancy felt the old reflex rise, that conditioned shrinking from open contradiction. It met something newer and held. You withheld meals as punishment, she said, each word measured. You sold my mare without legal notice. You dismissed staff who gave me food. You struck me in the yard 10 minutes ago before 20 witnesses. The room had gone very still. One driver looked down at his boots. The other stared fixedly at the wall as if manners could make him invisible. Mrs. Webber's mouth flattened. Delusion, nothing more. Hale turned to the Duke, who had remained near the door, arms behind his back, saying nothing. Your Grace, did you witness the strike? I did. Will you sign to that? I will. Hale wrote quickly then, pages filling, sand sprinkled, blotted, turned. He took statements from the drivers next. He called the stable boy. The boy stammered, swallowed, and confirmed he had been ordered back just as he reached for Thomas. Each sentence seemed to pain him, not from guilt, but from fear of who would hear it later. Nancy kept her gaze on the ledger rather than on Mrs. Webber's face. At length, Hale closed the book and tied the cord. Miss Webber, you may review and sign your statement. He pushed the page toward her. The script blurred at first from fatigue. She blinked until it steadied and read every line. Accurate, spare, no flourish. She took the pen in her left hand because the right would not hold pressure, and signed her name with awkward care. Mrs. Webber gave a soft sound of contempt. "You sign your own destruction." Nancy set down the pen. "I sign what I saw." Hale sanded the ink and stood. For now, no party leaves town without notice. Further inquiry by the magistrate this evening. Mrs. Webber stiffened. "I have engagements in Bath." "You have instructions," Hale said. He bowed to the Duke, then to no one else, and left with the ledger under his arm. The room emptied in uneasy increments. Drivers first, stable boy last, pausing at the threshold to look back at Nancy as if memorizing her face so he would believe later that mercy had happened in daylight. When only 4 remained, Mrs. Webber moved close enough that Nancy could smell lavender over smoke. "You think him your saviour," she whispered, eyes flicking toward the Duke. "You are a fool. Men of rank do not rescue girls like you. They use them, then wash their hands." Nancy's pulse thudded once at her throat, but her answer came without tremor. "Then my hands are already cleaner than yours." For a heartbeat, Mrs. Webber looked as though she might strike again in spite of witnesses, law, and consequence. Instead, she turned and swept from the room, daughters trailing in pale silence. Nancy let out the breath she had been holding and immediately felt how little remained in her. Her knees softened. She reached for the table edge. The Duke crossed the distance in 2 strides and stopped close enough that she felt the heat from his coat. "Sit down," he said. "I am well. You are upright by will alone. Sit." She sat because refusal now would be vanity, not dignity. The chair creaked under her weight. Her bandaged hand throbbed with her pulse. He looked at the signed page still drying on the table, then at her face. "You could have blamed the boy and protected yourself from your stepmother's retaliation." "Yes, you did not." "He moved when I asked. Fear stopped him, not cruelty." The Duke's gaze held hers for a long moment that felt less like scrutiny than calculation revising itself in real time. Then he reached for the blotter, lifted her statement carefully so the ink would not smear, and handed it to the footman waiting by the door. "Take this to my solicitor's clerk. It is to be copied at once and returned before evening." The footman bowed and left at speed. Nancy stared after the page. That sheet now existed in duplicate. Harder to bury, harder to alter. Her throat tightened with a reaction she did not permit to become tears. The Duke drew a folded handkerchief from his sleeve and set it beside her on the table, not touching her. "Broth is coming," he said. "You will drink it." She almost refused from habit. Then she remembered Thomas sleeping with his arm secure because she had accepted help rather than pride. "As you command, Your Grace," she said. His mouth shifted by a fraction. Not quite a smile. Something nearer to recognition. He turned toward the door, then paused, speaking without looking back. "You wrote me a refusal this morning. You have now refused her in front of witnesses, refused fear in front of authority, and refused to buy safety with another person's ruin. Do not faint before I decide what to do with such disobedience." He left before she could answer. Boots measured on the corridor boards, and Nancy sat very still in the chair, wet hem cooling against her ankles, hand burning under fresh linen, while outside the rain kept falling, and the inn prepared for an evening inquiry that would not be governed by Mrs. Webber's voice alone. A maid came in before Nancy had finished steadying her breath, carrying a tray that trembled against her apron strings. The bowl was plain earthenware, chipped at the rim, steam rising in thin white threads that smelled of chicken, onion, and too much salt. Behind her followed the same footman who had carried Nancy's signed pages to be copied, rain still beaded on his shoulders, a folded packet of copied pages tucked beneath one arm. He set the packet on the table, bowed once, and withdrew without speaking. The maid placed the bowl directly before Nancy, bobbed a nervous curtsy toward the doorway, and fled as if rank itself had weight and she had stepped under it too long. Nancy looked at the broth and felt hunger strike so sharply she had to press her teeth together. 2 days without proper food had trained her stomach to expect little. Warmth now felt almost violent. She picked up the spoon with her left hand, awkward with the angle, and lifted one mouthful. The heat touched her split lip and stung. She lowered the spoon again. The Duke returned before she could try a second time. He had removed his gloves. Rain had darkened his cuffs. A strip of wet had worked loose at his collar where his cravat no longer sat perfectly straight. He crossed to the table, glanced once at the copied statement, then at the untouched bowl. "Drink it while it is warm." Nancy raised the spoon obediently and took a careful swallow. The broth settled like fire in an empty grate. Her hands shook harder, not less. He did not sit. He stood beside the hearth with one hand braced on the mantel, a carved figure in black wool and rainwater, watching the door rather than her face. The room held no one else. Corridor noise came muted through the panels, boots passing, low voices, the clink of glasses from the tap room. Outside, rain stitched the window in fine silver lines. Nancy finished half the bowl and stopped, breath shallow, the old discipline of scarcity resisting fullness. "More," he said. "I cannot." "You can. Slowly." She obeyed again. By the time the church bell beyond the market square struck the half-hour, she had emptied the bowl down to the cloudy dregs and felt both steadier and ashamed of having needed instruction to eat. The Duke pushed a folded cloth toward her with 2 fingers. "Wipe your mouth. The cut is bleeding again." Nancy did as ordered. The linen came away, pink. She folded it small and precise, as if neatness could repay what she had taken. He picked up the copied statement and scanned it line by line. Hale's clerk copied accurately. No alteration. Relief loosened something in her chest she had not admitted was clenched. "Thank you!" His eyes lifted to hers. "Do not thank me for preventing forgery. That should be ordinary." "Ordinary has been scarce." The words escaped before caution could catch them. Nancy expected rebuke. He gave none. His gaze moved to her bandaged palm, then to the raw knuckles above it. "She made you carry trunks in rain from dawn," he said. Nancy stared. "How do you know that?" "I arrived at the gate 3 minutes before the axle broke. I saw you on the rear bench." He said it without emphasis, yet the sentence altered the room. She had believed that first moment in the mud was the first moment he had seen her at all. Heat rose along her throat, not from embarrassment alone, but from the shock of being observed in the exact shape of her humiliation. "I thought," she began, then stopped. "Say it!" "I thought men like you looked through women like me." Something hard shifted in his face, then held still again. "I looked." Silence followed. Nancy felt the spoon cool in her hand. The words were not gentle. They were not meant to be. They struck deeper because they carried no ornament. A knock sounded at the door. The footman entered at once, face composed. "Your Grace, Officer Hale requests your signature in the hall. The magistrate's clerk has arrived from town." The Duke did not move. "Tell Hale I will sign in 5 minutes." "Yes, Your Grace." The footman bowed and retreated. Nancy set down the spoon. "You should go." He ignored the suggestion. "You are not returning to Mrs. Weber's carriage." She looked up sharply. "I must, unless I am to stand in the road." "No." One word again, final as a lock turned. "I am still under her roof." "Not tonight." She could not follow the path of that statement. "By what authority?" "Mine, if required. The magistrate's, once he hears your signed account and the witnesses to assault." He walked to the table and set his hand beside the copied pages. Long fingers splayed against damp wood. "I have secured 2 rooms on this floor, one for Thomas and his mother, one for you. Mrs. Davies from my London household is travelling with us from Marlborough by post-chaise and will arrive before dark. Until then, Martha from the inn kitchen will remain outside your door." Nancy blinked at him. The names and arrangements came too quickly, each practical, each already decided. Protection offered in the grammar of logistics, not comfort. "You made these plans while I gave my statement." "I made them before you gave it." The pulse in her bandaged hand thudded against linen. "You assumed she would retaliate." "I do not assume. I observe patterns." He glanced toward the corridor, then back. "Mrs. Weber has used isolation as leverage for years. Remove isolation, remove leverage." Nancy felt suddenly unsteady in a way hunger had never caused. Not fear, not exactly. Exposure. To have the shape of her life named that plainly was like being stripped in cold air. She will call this abduction. She may call it anything she pleases in front of the magistrate. Words are less useful when ledgers disagree. He tapped the copied statement once. You gave dates, dismissed staff, sold property, withheld food, public strike. Hale has witnesses to each point, and my solicitor has records from your father's trust that do not reconcile with her accounts. Nancy stared at the inked pages, then back at him. You had records from my father's trust before today. Yes. Why? His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would refuse the question. Then he answered with blunt precision. Because I do not marry into unknown books. I requested a financial review when your stepmother opened negotiations. The review showed irregular withdrawals. I came to Bath to verify signatures in person. The truth landed with mixed edges. She had been investigated as part of a transaction. She had also been believed enough to prompt scrutiny of the numbers that trapped her. So this was business. At first, the words were quiet. He did not add to them. He did not need to. The space after at first filled with the memory of mud, the child's cry, the blow she had taken, his command in the yard. Nancy tried to stand. Her knees failed halfway and caught the chair with a scrape. The Duke moved one pace, stopped before touching her, and pointed to the seat. Sit down. I am trying not to be ordered every moment. Then consider this medical instruction relayed by a man with poor bedside manner. Despite herself, breath broke from her in something near a laugh, and not quite one. It hurt her lip. She sat. His mouth shifted by the smallest fraction. Not quite a smile. The knock came again, sharper this time. Officer Hale entered without waiting for full permission, ledger under his arm, rein on his hat brim. Your Grace, pardon the interruption. The magistrate asks whether the parties are prepared. We begin in 1 hour. The Duke inclined his head. We are prepared. Hale looked to Nancy. Miss Weber, are you fit to appear? Nancy straightened in the chair and kept her voice even. Yes, officer. Hale hesitated, eye catching the bowl, the bandage, the blood still faint at her mouth. If you require recess at any point, request it. The magistrate has agreed. Thank you. He set a folded paper beside the copied statement. Preliminary witness list. Confirm names if you can. Nancy scanned the list. Drivers, stable boy, innkeeper, Thomas's mother, Pritchard, 2 ostlers, 1 post boy who had seen the strike at the threshold. She touched one line with her left index finger. "Edwin Pike. He is the kitchen porter, not ostler. He saw from the scullery door." Hale corrected the note at once. The Duke signed Hale's ledger where indicated, hand steady, pen strokes heavy enough to indent the page. Hale sanded the signature, bowed, and withdrew. When the door shut, corridor sounds swelled and dimmed again. Nancy stared at the witness list as if looking long enough could keep each name from being worn down by pressure before evening. "She will threaten them," Nancy said. "Some will recant." "Some will, not all." He pulled a chair from the wall and placed it opposite hers. Then he sat. The action was simple. Its effect was not. Men of his rank did not usually sit in attendance beside women of her position in borrowed inn parlours. They issued instructions and departed. He remained. "You should be with the magistrate," she said. "I am with the witness, whose testimony she most wants to break. I am not fragile. I did not say fragile." He leaned back slightly, shoulders square, hands on the chair arms, and fixed his gaze on the door like a sentry taking post. "You are exhausted. You are injured. You are still prepared to stand in that chamber and speak precisely. That is not fragility. It is why I am here." Nancy felt the words physically, a pressure beneath the sternum difficult to name. Respect had been so scarce in her life that recognition felt almost indecent. Minutes passed. He did not move. Once footsteps paused outside her door and silk brushed the corridor wall. Mrs. Webber's lavender drifted under the jamb, sweet and cold. Nancy's spine stiffened. The Duke did not turn his head. He spoke toward the door, voice low but carrying. "Tell Mrs. Webber she will communicate through Officer Hale from this point forward." No answer came. Footsteps retreated, quick and uneven. Lavender thinned and vanished. Nancy realized she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. "She will hate you for that." "I'm accustomed. Most men prefer her friendship. Most men are welcome to it." He remained in the same position, the same stillness, as if moving might concede ground. Nancy watched the line of his profile against firelight, the scar at his temple whitening when his jaw set, the rain-dark hair drying in uneven strands. She had thought coldness meant absence. Sitting across from him now, she began to understand another possibility. Coldness as discipline, as barricade, as the only shape grief and rank had allowed him to keep without being consumed. The church bell struck again, one measured note after another. By the 7th, the room had shifted from afternoon grey to early evening dim. A maid brought fresh lamp oil. The Duke rose only long enough to move the flame farther from Nancy's sleeve, then resumed his seat. At last she said, "Why are you doing this?" He answered without pause, as if the sentence had been waiting behind his teeth. "Because you were told all day to be silent and you spoke, because you were struck and you did not strike downward in return. Because you were given one chance to save yourself by sacrificing a poorer witness, and you refused it." His gaze came to her face and held. "And because when you wrote no to me this morning, you proved you would tell the truth even when it cost you." Nancy's throat tightened. She looked down at her bandaged hand. The linen had begun to stain faintly where the wound seeped through. "You speak as if refusal were a virtue." "It is, when it is honest." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, every word measured and irreversible. "Hear me carefully, Miss Webber. Whatever is said in that chamber tonight, whatever bargain your stepmother offers, whatever pressure is applied through title, debt, or reputation, your answer remains your own. If you refuse me again tomorrow, next month, or 10 years from now, the refusal stands." The room went very quiet. Rain at the window, fire settling in the grate. distant clatter from the taproom below. He rose then, reached into his coat, and placed a sealed paper on the table between them. "My solicitor drafted this an hour ago. Temporary protection order request, to be filed at once if the magistrate confirms probable fraud and assault. It bars forced removal to any private institution, pending full hearing. Sign only if you wish it filed. Burn it if you do not." Nancy stared at the seal. Her name was written across the fold in his blunt hand. Not Miss Webber alone. Nancy Ann Webber. Fully as she had signed her letter. "When did you—" In the corridor outside the statement room. "You expected she might carry out her threat." "I expect people to continue until stopped." He stepped back from the table and gave her space, as if physical distance were part of the promise. "You asked by what authority," he said. "Use your own." She touched the edge of the paper with her left fingertips, then lifted her gaze to him. "And if I choose badly? Then it will be your choice, and we amend from there." No rhetoric, no vow of rescue, only a framework built around agency he refused to take from her, even now, even with the clock running toward inquiry. The corridor bell rang for assembly in the magistrate chamber. The Duke held out her own worn shawl, which someone had cleaned and dried without her noticing. He did not drape it over her shoulders. He waited until she took it herself. "Stand," he said. She stood. Her legs trembled once and settled. He opened the door, then paused on the threshold, turning just enough that she could see the storm-coloured steadiness in his eyes. "Walk beside me, not behind." Nancy drew the shawl close over her bandaged hand, lifted her chin and stepped into the corridor at his shoulder as the rain kept time against the inn windows and the hour for silence ended. The magistrate chamber was the inn's long supper room, cleared of tables, benches set in two facing rows, a coal fire burning low at the far wall beneath the county arms. Wet coats steamed. Ink and wool and smoke thickened the air. Officer Hale stood beside the clerk's desk, with the tied ledger under one arm. Mrs. Webber sat the two chairs from the hearth in plum silk that had dried without losing its lustre, Clara and Millicent on either side of her, pale and composed as painted porcelain. The magistrate, Mr. Fenwick, did not waste ceremony. He took names, he took rank, he took sequence. Nancy stood when called and repeated her account in the same spare order she had given before. Axle, fall, horse, blow, command, witness. Hale read from the copied statement and compared each line to the original. The 2 pages matched. The clerk marked both for record and sanded the signatures in silence. Pritchard confirmed the child's arm had been splinted correctly before he touched it. Thomas's mother confirmed Nancy had steadied the boy, and remained until he slept. The stable boy, Edwin Pike, shook as he spoke, and still said the same sentence twice. He stepped forward. Mrs. Webber called him back. Mrs. Webber answered with polished outrage. She produced folded papers from her reticule and laid them on the clerk's desk with 2 fingers, as if presenting invitations. Temporary guardianship, household debt assignment, medical concern for erratic female behaviour. Her voice stayed smooth while she spoke of burden and sacrifice, of ingratitude, of a stepdaughter made unstable by grief. Clara lowered her eyes at the proper moments. Millicent pressed a handkerchief to dry lashes that never truly wet. Their silence, which had followed Nancy for years like a second sentence, remained intact. They never gave evidence, and later no one claimed they had wished to. Then Rathmere's solicitor's packet was opened. Bank copies, trust withdrawals, sale records, signatures compared against dated exemplars from Nancy's father. Hale read each figure aloud. Each line narrowed the room. The magistrate asked Mrs. Webber to explain 3 large transfers made 6 days after the funeral, and a 4th made under an altered hand 2 months later. She called it household necessity. He asked why household necessity paid a jeweller in Bond Street and a gaming note in Bristol. She did not answer quickly enough. By the time the clock in the corridor struck 8, the rain had eased to a fine mist, and tension in the room had changed shape from noise to arithmetic. Mr. Fenwick requested the trust ledger itself. Hale looked to the sideboard where seized household books had been placed in a locked dispatch box an hour earlier. The key sat on the clerk's blotter. While the clerk reached for it, Mrs. Webber rose without permission, crossed in 3 fast steps, seized one ledger as soon as the lid opened, and turned toward the hearth. She moved with astonishing speed for a woman who had spent years letting servants carry her weight. "Those pages are private," she said sharply. "No man has the right—" She thrust the ledger toward the coals. Nancy reached her before anyone else did. Instinct outran pain. She caught the spine with her bandaged hand and drove the other into the grate to hook the falling leaves before flame took them. Heat bit at once, bright and total, through skin already split from cold. She dragged the ledger free and stumbled back, clutching it against her chest while sparks died on her sleeve. The room erupted. Hale shouted for order. The clerk smothered the grate with the iron screen. Rathmere crossed the floor and took the ledger from Nancy only after confirming she still held it. His jaw had gone rigid enough that the scar at his temple stood pale. "Water!" he said. "Now!" Pritchard was already there. He took Nancy's right hand, then her left, and hissed through his teeth at the red rising across her palm and fingers. "Cold, not ice! Linen, quickly!" Mrs. Webber was held by 2 constables before she reached the door. For the first time that day her polish cracked. "She ruined me first," she snapped toward Nancy. "I only finished what she began." Nancy's breath shook once and steadied. "You began it when my father died." Mr. Fenwick stood. "Mrs. Webber, sit down or be removed in irons." She sat. Pritchard dressed Nancy's burn at the side table with brisk, precise movements, while proceedings continued. She kept her eyes on the ledger, now blackened at one corner but legible. Hale read from the singed pages into the record before anyone could contest chain of custody. Every transfer was entered again. Every witness signed again. The protection order Rathmere had placed before Nancy was brought forward. She read it with her left hand braced on the table, then signed her full name. Mr. Fenwick approved immediate filing and handed the sealed copy to Hale for execution that night. When the testimonies closed, Mrs. Webber made one final attempt. She leaned toward the magistrate and lowered her voice to poison wrapped in silk. "Even if you indulge this theatre, she leaves with nothing but a ruined name. No house will take her." Rathmere stepped forward before Fenwick could answer. Rain-dark coat, face carved from restraint. "Good," he said. "Then write this plainly. I marry her only if she asks it." Silence held one breath. Then the magistrate struck the table once with his palm and gave judgment. Fraud substantiated pending formal assize, with sufficient evidence for immediate seizure of contested accounts. Public assault witnessed and entered. Guardianship void. Mrs. Webber to be removed under warrant and held for transfer at first light. Clara and Millicent released to separate surety under supervision. No access to Nancy's property or rooms. Household staff listed as acting under coercive instruction would give depositions within 3 days. No punitive order was to be laid against them by any family member in the interim. Hale took the warrant and read it aloud from first word to last. Outside the chamber door, people had gathered in the passage despite the hour. They saw Mrs. Webber led out between constables, silk rustling against rough wool, mouth set hard as stone. They saw Nancy standing with both hands wrapped, pale and upright beside the man she had refused at dawn. The same eyes that had watched her tied to a rear bench now watched the warrant pass. Pritchard insisted on immediate treatment in a private room. Rathmere did not argue. He sat in a straight chair by the bed while ointment was applied and fresh bandages layered from palm to wrist. He did not pace. He did not speak except to answer what was necessary. Midnight came, then 1, then 2, each hour marked by the inn clock and the slow collapse of fire in the grate. He remained in the same chair, shoulders square, gaze on the door whenever anyone entered. At last, when Pritchard tied the final knot and declared the hand safe if kept clean, Rathmere spoke without looking away from the white linen wrapping her fingers. "Your refusal is framed above my fireplace because no one had ever spoken to me without fear, and I would rather be refused honestly by you than obeyed falsely by the world." Nancy had no answer ready for that sentence. She slept before she found one. 3 days later, in Mr. Fenwick's office in Bath, sunlight thin as paper fell across a long table covered in documents. Deeds, account inventories, affidavits from dismissed servants, seizure orders, property restoration schedules. Each item was read aloud, countersigned, sanded, sealed. Nancy recovered legal control of the Weber Trust, and the house entailed through her father's line. The old study was restored to her claim in writing. Mrs. Davies's pension was reinstated from recovered funds. Edwin Pike's name was entered under protected witness and later placed with wages in Rathmere's London stables at his request, with Nancy's consent. Rathmere set one final document before her. A marriage settlement drafted to his instruction and corrected twice in her presence. Her property remained hers in full. Her income could not be transferred by marriage. Any residence required her written assent. She could refuse the marriage at the church door without financial penalty, public claim, or legal retaliation. A clause at the end, in the same blunt legal hand, stated that future refusal would be binding in any domestic matter not touching immediate safety. She read every line. She asked for 2 amendments, one for annual support to the displaced household servants proven innocent, one for unrestricted access to her father's books and papers wherever housed. Both were added before signing. Fenwick folded his hands. "Miss Weber, do you consent of your own will?" Nancy looked at Rathmere. He did not move. He did not prompt. Command had gone from his posture, replaced by waiting that cost him effort to hold. "Yes," she said, "I ask it." They married quietly in the inn chapel that afternoon, with 6 witnesses, rain beginning again against the leaded panes, as vows were spoken in a voice that did not tremble. In early winter, when frost silvered the windows at Rathmere House, Nancy stood in the drawing-room before the fireplace while a footman set the final nail and stepped back. Above the mantel, in plain dark frame, hung one sheet of paper in her own hand. "Your Grace, I received through my stepmother the honour of your offer." At the lower fold the wax seal, with the simple N, was split where it had been opened, the broken impression preserved under glass. Not displayed as conquest, not hidden as embarrassment, kept where firelight touched it every evening as a standing term of the life they had chosen. Rathmere came to stand beside her, close enough that she felt his warmth through wool. "It remains there," he said, "so this house remembers." Nancy lifted her bandaged hand, now healing clean, and touched the frame once with 2 fingers. "My no mattered first," she said. "That is why my yes can live here. It will matter always." The fire settled. Outside wind moved along the stone terraces. Inside the letter stayed above the hearth, and no one in that house ever spoke her consent, as if it were owed again,